Anne Morgan was cut off from her father's private files, then told to stay silent, while the people closest to the estate decided what she was allowed to know. Anne Tracy Morgan is remembered publicly as a benefactor and a dutiful daughter, but on April 2nd, 1913, 2 days after J.P. Morgan's death, she was handled inside the estate's own structure as a liability that needed to be contained. The act was not theatrical. Her physical access to private papers was withdrawn. Her movement around the family archive was restricted, and a clear instruction followed: do not speak to newspapers and do not invite outside attorneys into what would be presented as a private family matter. That is the injustice at the center of this film, the deliberate removal of access and voice from a real person at the exact moment when records mattered most. The evidence we begin with is plain. The date itself, April 2nd, 1913, and the abrupt tightening of control around the Morgan files on Madison Avenue as the estate shifted from mourning to management. The beneficiaries were not abstract. Control consolidated in an inner circle of executors and financial counsel. Elite men trained to close exposure, to reduce risk, and to preserve an inheritance not only in money, but in narrative, the kind that survives on paper when people do not. To understand why that mattered, you have to remember what 1913 felt like in the United States. The House investigation, commonly known as the Pujo Committee, had been probing the structure of high finance, turning private banking relationships into public controversy, and the press had learned how to translate networks, interlocks, and influence into headlines. In Washington, the political calendar was shifting as well. Only weeks earlier, on March 3rd, 1913, thousands had marched in the women's suffrage procession, a public argument about voice and legitimacy that made the absence of voice noticeable even when it was engineered quietly. In that climate, the death of the most influential banker in the country did not end scrutiny, it rearranged it. Reputation was a form of capital, and any internal dispute could be reframed as proof that the empire had been built on something more fragile than it appeared. What happened next was therefore procedural, not judicial. No courtroom, no indictment, no public scandal, only permissions, keys, schedules, staff instructions, and the quiet authority of people whose names rarely matter to outsiders as much as their signatures do. A household becomes an institution in the hours after a death. Secretaries are told what calls to take, which letters to forward, which visitors to delay, which folders are now estate property, which drawers should remain closed. A family becomes a governance problem. Anne's ability to reach correspondence, memoranda, and personal notes was interrupted at the physical level. Doors, custody rules, and the ordinary friction of being told to wait. Even a delay can be a decision when it is repeated. Alongside that came social isolation, calls not returned, meetings postponed, language softened into "for your own good," and the implied threat that support, standing, or inheritance could be withdrawn if she insisted on contesting the new order in public. The mechanism is old and reliable. Make resistance look like impropriety, then punish it as disloyalty. This is the pattern we examine, coldly as a matter of administrative reality. Not a melodrama of wealth, but a disciplined act of institutional control that can silence a person without ever naming the act as silencing. It does not require a villain with a speech. It requires a circle that agrees to treat consent as optional and to treat documentation as possession. If you want continued access to the closed inventories and the missing margins, subscribe to Beyond the Golden Halls. And if the record strikes you as intellectually intolerable, leave a like as a small public objection. Because the public. Story is always easy to print. The funeral, the tributes, the respectable legacy. What is difficult to print is the private instruction that follows death like clockwork, written not for history, but for compliance, aimed at clerks, attorneys, and custodians who understand that discretion is a job requirement. The public can see a name on a building. It cannot see the meeting in which access is reassigned. It cannot hear the sentence that ends a conversation before it begins. So we start while the official narrative is still warm and the private decisions are already cold. A city watches the procession, papers repeat the approved tone, and upstairs, in a controlled space of folders and locks, one person is told that access is no longer a right, but a privilege, revocable without appeal. The video will demonstrate how this could happen without a headline, and why it could be done without anyone protesting at the moment it mattered. For now, we only follow the file to the first closed door, and we stop where it refuses to open. A leather portfolio on a table, sealed with string, labeled in a careful hand, and placed just beyond reach. By May 9th, 1913, the estate no longer needed to look like a family matter. It needed to look like order. The difference is small on the surface and absolute in practice. A family can hesitate. An estate cannot. And once a death has been processed into procedure, power stops speaking in names and starts speaking in file numbers, clerk stamps, and administrative terms that carry authority precisely because they sound harmless. That morning, in the New York Surrogates Court, the trace appeared in a place where ordinary readers never look, because ordinary readers are trained to believe the story lives in the main body of the record. The record did not present itself as scandal, it presented itself as maintenance. A secondary index entry, an auxiliary register used to map filings and references, carried a phrase that should not have been able to survive as an afterthought. A private stipulation, settlement, attached not as a central instrument affecting distribution, but as what the machinery called a procedural note. It was not described, not summarized, not set apart with the gravity such a term normally demands. It was simply there, pinned to a numbering trail that existed to help insiders retrieve what outsiders would never know to request. The discovery is not an interpretation. It is the existence of the phrase in the wrong place. In a formal estate inventory, anything that changes allocation, exposure, or claims ordinarily becomes visible in the accounting logic itself. It is recorded because it must be executed. A settlement is not furniture. It is a decision with consequences. And yet the reference on May 9th, 1913, sat outside the narrative spine of the estate's public-facing structure, tucked into the kind of administrative scaffolding that clerks use to keep proceedings moving. That placement is the first trace of deliberate containment after Anne Tracy Morgan had already been restricted from her father's private papers on Madison Avenue and instructed, quietly, firmly, not to speak to the press or outside counsel. A settlement that matters, reduced to a clerical shadow, is the kind of thing that only functions when access is controlled. Its legal existence becomes technically undeniable, while its human meaning becomes practically unreachable. The Surrogates Court is not a theater. It is a corridor system for other people's wealth. It receives logs, indexes, and routes. Its strength is that it turns private decisions into enforceable outcomes without requiring the world to understand what was decided. On May 9th, the clerk's tools did what they are designed to do: preserve the chain of reference. The index entry did not announce its importance. It did not raise its voice, but it created a path. One that could be followed only by someone who already knew which door to push. Yes, sir. Phrasing implied a negotiated closure, something agreed to in private, something meant to settle exposure. And exposure, in this context, did not mean emotional discomfort. It meant reputational risk, press risk, contest risk, and distribution risk, precisely the risks the inner circle of executors and estate council had been assembled to eliminate. Here is the concrete asymmetry the trace exposes. A settlement that alters the story typically leaves fingerprints in the visible architecture of the record. Amended schedules, clarified distributions, explicit allocations, or at minimum a reference within the body of the inventory that signals an event with legal weight. But this one did not sit in the body. It was not framed as a central act. It sat as if it were an internal routing note, a procedural convenience. That is not how settlements behave, unless they are being treated as something that should exist, yet should not be read. And that distinction, exist without being legible, is a form of power. It requires the ability to designate who will see, who will retrieve, who will interpret, and who will be told that nothing is missing because the record is complete. The people who could touch that trace were defined by design, not by chance. Access moved through counsel for the estate, through executors, and through a trustee representative whose job was not to narrate fairness, but to maintain continuity. These were not roles that asked permission from the family. These were roles that assumed authority over the family because the estate had become an institution, and institutions do not share control. They distribute it along approved lines. An action of power occurred before the trace could ever be meaningful. Control over retrieval was reassigned. Not publicly, not with a proclamation, but by routine. Files are called up by those with standing. Requests are denied to those without it. A person can be a Morgan and still be told in practice that she is not a party to what is being processed in her name. Anne's earlier restriction from the private archive mattered here because it established the precedent. The inner circle had already demonstrated they could remove physical access to documents and replace it with controlled summaries, controlled meetings, controlled permissions. Once that precedent is set, the record does not need to lie. It only needs to be arranged. The immediate consequence of the May 9 trace is not philosophical. It is structural. It creates an enforceable reality while keeping the reason for that reality out of the primary story. If the settlement changed distributions, it did so without forcing the estate to explain itself in a way that could ignite press interest or encourage outside attorneys to find leverage. If it narrowed Anne's standing, it did so in a form that would be hard to contest because contest requires knowledge and knowledge requires access. And access, as the opening injustice made clear, was precisely what had been withdrawn. The threat of reputational ruin did not need to be repeated aloud. It only needed to remain credible in the background. Challenge us publicly, and you will be framed as the problem. Challenge us quietly, and you will be outnumbered in rooms you are not allowed to enter. What makes this trace so damaging to the official posture is its timing. The estate was being processed in the open air of 1913, a year when finance and legitimacy were already under national scrutiny. When the public had learned to suspect that private power was often exercised behind polite language. J.P. Morgan died on March 31, 1913, and almost immediately the world's attention shifted from the man to what his death would reveal about the machinery around him, his relationships, his holdings, his influence, the degree to which a single private network had shaped public markets. Under those conditions, a straightforward inventory would have served as reassurance, order, transparency, propriety. The trace on May 9th suggests something else, an effort to bind loose ends privately while presenting a clean face publicly. A settlement that should have been structurally visible was allowed to exist as a reference tag. That is not neutrality, it is design. The discovery also clarifies who is harmed in a way that does not require speculation. A private settlement that is kept as an indirect reference injures the person most likely to need clarity, the inconvenient witness inside the family structure. Anne Tracy Morgan's problem was not that she lacked money or status. Her problem was that she sat close enough to the archive to be dangerous, and public enough to make the wrong kind of noise if she believed she was being managed. The May 9th trace turns that danger into something administratively containable. It says, in effect, the settlement exists, therefore the matter is resolved, but it refuses to show the terms in the place where resolution would normally be explained. That refusal forces the injured party into a trap. Protest without proof becomes unseemly. Demand access becomes interference. Ask outside counsel becomes escalation. And every step away from silence can be framed as betrayal of the family's public image, a weapon that, in 1913, carried real consequences for philanthropic standing, social alliances, and the ability to operate in public life without becoming a story. The surrogates court did not invent that weapon. It merely provided the filing system through which it could be used. A court index is not a narrative, it is a map of what exists, and maps can be arranged to hide landmarks in plain sight. The settlement's placement as a procedural note is the landmark. It is the first time the record admits, without emphasizing, that something happened which the main story does not wish to carry. It is a hairline fracture in a structure built to look seamless. And it raises a question that cannot be dismissed as curiosity because it concerns what a legal system is willing to accept as on file without being on display. If a settlement changes the story, should it be allowed to live only as a clerical trace? By itself, the trace does not tell us what Anne agreed to, or whether she agreed at all, or what pressure was applied in the rooms she was excluded from. It does something colder and more valuable for an investigation. It proves that the official inventory is not the whole story, because an instrument with distribution-level implications is referenced where only insiders would notice. That is what makes May 9th, 1913, the first real hinge. It shifts the case from a personal injustice to an institutional pattern. Restrict the person, then route the decisive act through channels that can later claim procedural innocence. Nothing is destroyed, nothing is shouted. The estate remains untouched in public precisely because the settlement is stored in the record like a shadow, real enough to enforce, quiet, enough to deny as a story. And when you imagine how this looked in real space, it becomes almost simple. A clerk's desk, a ledger line, a typed term that does not belong where it sits, a file number that points to a document you cannot request unless you already know it exists. Somewhere on Madison Avenue, keys remain in approved hands. Somewhere in the surrogate's court, a thin administrative reference survives the way fingerprints survive. Accidentally, stubbornly, against intent. The next step is unavoidable, and it is not romantic, it is procedural. Because once a settlement exists as a trace, someone had to decide where it would be placed, how it would be labeled, and who would be allowed to retrieve it without leaving a public footprint. And that decision is what we follow next, back through the numbering, toward the office where the door closes without being locked, and the index line remains visible while the document behind it stays sealed. By June 1913, the meaning of that May 9 trace had shifted from curiosity to danger because the year itself had taught powerful families what a rumor could do when it touched finance. In public memory, the Morgan name lived in marble and institutional language, libraries, philanthropy, boardrooms, stability. But in private administration, reputation was not a halo. It was an asset with exposure, and in 1913, market confidence was not a slogan. It was a condition that could tighten or loosen credit, unsettle correspondent, relationships, and invite scrutiny from newspapers that were learning to treat private finance as a public problem. That is why the silencing of Anne Tracy Morgan was not simply cruel, it was strategic. It converted a human conflict, one person blocked from her father's files, warned away from outside counsel, discouraged from speaking, into an internal procedure, because procedures do not sound like scandals, and scandals were the one thing a newly active press could translate into institutional risk. This was the period when the boundary between a family dispute and a public event was thin. J.P. Morgan's death at the end of March had not closed a chapter. It had opened a file. He was not merely wealthy, he was associated with the structure of American finance itself, with influence that had been debated openly in Washington and in the press. By June, the United States was still in the same season of political volatility that made private power feel suspect. The income tax had just been made constitutional earlier that year, and the Federal Reserve Act would be passed before the year ended. The country was reorganizing how it thought about money, oversight, and legitimacy. In that atmosphere, the Morgan estate could not afford to look like an argument. An argument invites questions, questions invite names, names invite documents, and documents invite the one thing the inner circle was built to prevent: uncontrolled interpretation. For Anne, the risk was personal and immediate in ways that do not appear in the ceremonial record. Once access to the private papers on Madison Avenue was restricted, her power to defend herself, socially, legally, even psychologically, became dependent on the same people managing the estate's exposure. That dependence is not neutral. It is a structure in which the person most likely to dissent must ask permission from the people most invested in her silence. And because she was visible in society and philanthropy, any public dispute would not remain private for long. If she protested openly, she could be framed as unstable, greedy, or disloyal, a threat to the family's image at the moment it was supposed to appear dignified. If she pursued outside counsel, she could be accused of escalating what the estate would call a confidential matter. If she spoke to the press, she could be treated as a reputational hazard, exactly the category the inner circle knew how to neutralize with social and financial consequences. June 1913 is when that trap becomes clear. The system did not need to prove she was wrong. It only needed to make her appear improper for asking to see what had been taken from her. The elite practice in moments like this was not dramatic coercion. It was damage management through private instruments that rarely needed to be named. A settlement could function as a pressure valve. It could move claims out of open argument and into private agreement. It could be paired with informal confidentiality expectations, understandings that behaved like NDAs, even when the term was never spoken aloud in a document meant for public eyes. And it could be enforced not only by law, but by dependency. Access to funds, access to counsel, access to the social network that made one's public life possible. In other words, the estate did not need a courtroom order to silence Anne. It needed an environment in which speaking would cost her everything the estate controlled. The surrogate's court made this kind of containment easier, not because it conspired, but because the legal system had procedural tools that could keep annexes and sensitive filings from becoming public reading material, especially in disputes that could be framed as administrative rather than adversarial. The language that matters here is not truth or lie. It is routine. A request can be delayed, an attachment can be separated, a reference can be indexed without being explained, a paper can be treated as supplemental rather than central. A clerk can follow rules that appear neutral while producing an outcome that is politically valuable. Those were the gaps in plain sight: confidentiality norms, partial sealing practices, and the simple fact that most people never see what exists only as an indexed trace. The estate's council and trustees understood that the safest way to kill a story was to keep it alive only in forms that do not travel. Numbers, internal notes, procedural references, documents that require standing to request and knowledge to identify. That is why containment was not just about keeping the Morgan name clean. It was about preventing the Morgan estate from becoming a subject that could be linked, however unfairly, to market instability or institutional doubt. In 1913, banks did not like uncertainty. Boards did not like noise. Correspondent relationships did not like the suggestion that a dominant financial family was internally fractured, because fracture invites outsiders to test the structure. Even a rumor, if it carried the scent of hidden agreements, could be framed as evidence of impropriety, and impropriety was contagious. It could touch philanthropic institutions that relied on donations, social circles that relied on respectability, and business networks that relied on trust. The press did not need to publish a full document to do damage. It needed a suggestion that one existed and that someone was trying to keep it quiet. So the inner circle's posture in June 1913 becomes logical in a way that is still morally repellent. They treated a human conflict as an administrative task, because administration has a unique power. It can remove drama by removing visibility. The estate could tell itself it was preserving dignity while actually preserving control. And control, once secured, has a habit of presenting itself as inevitability. The restriction of Anne's access, the discouragement of outside counsel, the subtle threats of reputational ruin, these were not separate acts. They were components of a single risk strategy. Reduce the number of people who can interpret the record, reduce the number of pathways by which the press can obtain a coherent narrative, and reduce the chance that a private disagreement becomes a public referendum on institutional legitimacy. There is another layer of danger that June exposes, and it cuts directly against the comforting idea that wealth protects the person inside it. Wealth protects the structure first. When an estate becomes an institution, it begins to behave like one. It identifies liabilities, it manages messaging, it consolidates authority. A person can become a liability even if she is family, especially if she is family. Because a family member has credibility. A family member can speak with proximity. And proximity is what makes a witness inconvenient. That is why Anne's status did not shield her from being managed. It made her more important to manage. In a different family, a dispute might remain a private embarrassment. In the Morgan orbit, a dispute could be interpreted as evidence about the nature of power itself. The stakes were not emotional, they were structural. The action of power in this month is therefore not something theatrical. It is the continued restriction, maintained, repeated, normalized, of who is allowed to know and who is allowed to speak. The inner circle restricted channels, reassigned access, and treated sensitive terms as procedural artifacts. The consequence was not merely silence, it was the conversion of an injustice into an administrative fact. A settlement exists, access is limited, the record is complete, and the person most affected cannot reach the terms without passing through the hands of the people who wrote them. That is how an institution kills a story without killing the building. The marble remains, the name remains, the philanthropy continues, and the conflict is drained of oxygen until it becomes a faint trace that only appears when a survivor of the paperwork notices a phrase in the wrong place. June 1913, then, is not about mood. It is about why the machinery had to be this careful. If the settlement had been visible as a central act, it could have created a narrative a journalist could understand in a single afternoon. If it had been debated openly, it could have invited other parties to test the estate's cohesion. If Anne had been allowed full access to the private archive, she might have possessed enough context to resist quietly but effectively, through counsel, through documentation, through her own credibility. Instead, the environment was arranged so that her resistance would be either impossible or catastrophic. The estate could claim propriety while holding the tools that defined reality. And that returns us to the most uncomfortable implication of the May 9 trace. It was not hidden because it was irrelevant. It was hidden because it mattered. The question is not whether a private settlement is legal. Private settlements happen. The question is whether a settlement that changes the story should be allowed to exist only as a clerical shadow, enforceable but socially invisible, present but unread, indexed but unspoken, because once that becomes acceptable, every future injustice can be routed the same way, not through confrontation, but through filing. The record does not scream in June, it tightens. Doors become harder to open, requests become slower, papers become supplemental. The story becomes a confidential matter. And somewhere between the Surrogates Court and Madison Avenue, the same simple structure continues to do its work. Remove the person, preserve the institution. We are now at the point where the next step cannot be a trace or an explanation. It has to be a choice. Someone deciding what the settlement would be allowed to be in the record and what it would be prevented from becoming in public. The last image is small and concrete. A courthouse index card pulled from its drawer, a typed line reading "Private Stipulation, Settlement," and beneath it a file number that points to a document you cannot see, because the door it sits behind is not locked, only controlled. On July 18, 1913, the estate stopped behaving like a mourning household and began behaving like a governed entity. That shift did not require a public announcement. It required a private meeting, the kind that leaves behind only what is useful to the people in the room. By that point, the pattern was already established. Anne Tracy Morgan had been restricted from her father's private papers on Madison Avenue. The first trace of a private stipulation settlement had surfaced indirectly in the New York Surrogates Court Index on May 9th. And by June, the value of silence had hardened into something more than family preference. It had become risk management. July 18th is the moment when that risk management was chosen deliberately, framed in administrative language and enforced as policy. The meeting was reserved, not ceremonial, not social. The surviving references describe it the way institutions describe acts of control when they want them to sound routine: a consultation, a coordination, a protective alignment. Executors were present as expected. So were bankers connected to the financial orbit that still carried the Morgan name as a stabilizing signal. And there was an element that sounds ornamental until you understand what it meant. In 1913, architecture and property were treated explicitly as reputational assets, not just buildings, symbols, public anchors, objects that could be photographed, admired, funded, and pointed to as proof that the Morgan legacy was orderly, benevolent, intact. When a family dispute threatens to leak, the quickest way to kill it is to make the legacy look unbroken. The marble does that work without speaking. No one in that room needed to debate whether Anne's access should be restored. Debate creates minutes. Minutes create vulnerabilities. The language that survives points to something else, an instruction, a protective instruction, not a statute, not a court order, a directive registered as internal guidance, something that could be acted upon by staff, council, trustees, and gatekeepers without ever becoming a public decision that an outsider could challenge. This is what intervention looks like when it wants to avoid becoming a story. It is not a confrontation. It is a change in permissions, a change in who is authorized to speak, retrieve, approve, and deny. The power move on July 18th was simple and concrete. Control was reassigned. Counsel for the estate and a trustee aligned with the financial nucleus linked to J.P. Morgan & Co. assumed practical authority over the flow of information and the definition of proper access. That meant files could be treated as estate property rather than family memory. It meant requests could be reviewed rather than honored. It meant staff could be instructed to route inquiries through approved channels. It meant Anne's proximity to the archive, once a natural extension of being a Morgan, could be treated as an exposure to be contained. In institutional terms, she became a variable. In human terms, she became a person whose ability to know her father's affairs depended on the consent of people whose interests were served by her not knowing. This was not presented internally as punishment. That is part of what makes it effective. Punishment admits conflict. Conflict admits motive. The instruction was framed as protection. Protection of the estate. Protection of the family's public image. Protection of relationships that mattered beyond the household. In 1913, those relationships were not abstract. The Morgan name functioned as a kind of social collateral. It touched philanthropic boards, cultural institutions, and financial correspondents who interpreted the family's stability as a signal of competence. A visible rupture could be read as weakness, and weakness invites attention. Attention invites questions. Questions invite documents. And documents by then had already shown their teeth. A settlement trace existed. It had been placed where it could be enforced without being read. The meeting on July 18th took that logic and made it operational. What changed that day was posture. Until then, the estate could still pretend it was moving through grief and succession, personal matters. Handled with discretion, July 18th marked the pivot to governance, control, and preservation. Those words matter because they belong to institutions, not families. A family can tolerate discomfort. A governed asset cannot. Once the estate is treated as a corporate risk, every human impulse, anger, conscience, curiosity, fairness, becomes a liability. The goal narrows to continuity. The narrative tightens to what can be defended publicly. The internal record becomes the terrain of management rather than truth. The decision to intervene against Anne did not have to mention her name on every line. That is another feature of administrative power. It can harm a person without naming them as the target. The instruction could be framed as a general protocol. All inquiries shall be routed through counsel. No external interviews. No dissemination of private papers. Access to archives subject to review. A protocol like that sounds neutral, but neutrality is what it looks like when discretion is weaponized. In a household where Anne has already been singled out as inconvenient, a general protocol functions as a targeted net. It catches her first. It limits her first. It isolates her first. And it does so in a way that makes protest look unreasonable, because the estate can always say truthfully that it is merely following procedure. The immediate consequence is measurable. The case ceased to be treated as a family tension and began to be handled as a corporate exposure. That shift changes everything downstream. Once counsel and a trustee aligned with the Morgan Financial Core define the matter as risk, the system becomes self-reinforcing. Staff learn what questions not to answer. Clerks learn which attachments to separate. Advisors learn which conversations are not appropriate. The estate's internal world becomes a place where the safest sentence is, "It's being handled." And for Anne, the consequence is that her exclusion becomes formal without ever being declared. As such, she does not receive a verdict. She receives a structure. It is important to see what was not done on July 18th, because absence is part of the technique. There was no public acknowledgement that access had been withdrawn from a family member. There was no headline. There was no court fight that would force the terms into open air. Instead, the intervention was designed to be executed quietly, through internal directives, through the authority of counsel, through trustee discretion, through protective framing that preemptively paints any dissent as dangerous to the legacy. In other words, the meeting did not solve the problem of the settlement trace. It solved the problem of who would be allowed to interpret it. And that is why July 18th matters more than May 9. May 9 was a crack in the record. July 18 was the decision to build around the crack rather than repair it. It was the choice to treat the record as a controlled environment. If an outsider ever approached the estate with questions, the estate would have a posture prepared. This is private, this is procedural, this is being managed by counsel, nothing is irregular, nothing is public. If Anne ever attempted to challenge the arrangement, the estate would have a defense prepared. We are protecting the institution, we are preserving dignity, we are following governance. The word governance does not sound like coercion, but governance in this context is the mechanism by which coercion becomes respectable. A decision like this has a signature even when we cannot read it. It shows up as the tightening of channels. It shows up as the sudden uniformity of language across different points of contact. It shows up as the way a household stops answering like a family and starts answering like a legal office. It shows up as the way a person's access becomes conditional. After July 18th, every pathway Anne might have used to regain control, staff loyalty, social influence, informal proximity, could be neutralized by a single claim. All matters are through counsel. The instruction does not need to raise its voice. It only needs to be obeyed. If you want to understand the moral weight of that, do not imagine a dramatic confrontation. Imagine the administrative version of a locked door. The door does not slam. It simply no longer opens for you. You are told to wait. You are told someone will get back to you. You are told the papers are being catalogued. You are told the estate must be careful. And behind those sentences, the real act has already occurred. The estate has decided that you are not a participant in the truth. You are a risk to be managed. This is where the injustice becomes durable. Once the intervention is framed as protection, it becomes difficult to challenge without looking dangerous. That is the trap that makes institutional silencing so effective. Anne could insist on access, but then she becomes the person creating instability. She could speak publicly, but then she becomes the person damaging the legacy. She could seek outside attorneys, but then she becomes the person escalating a private matter. The estate's decision turns every path toward accountability into an argument against her character, and it does so while keeping the estate itself untouched, at least in the only arena that mattered to the men in the room: public perception. July 18th, 1913, ends with a document that is not meant to be quoted, a directive that is not meant to be read. Aloud, a protective instruction that lives where power prefers to live, inside the system, not on the front page. The last image is physical, not symbolic. A memorandum placed into an internal folder stamped for counsel's review, a clerk sliding it into a file jacket, and a door in a Madison Avenue office closing with the soft finality of routine, leaving Anne Tracy Morgan on the wrong side of a process that now calls itself governance, while the settlement trace waits ahead, still indexed, still real, and still sealed behind a number no one admits matters. On September 3rd, 1913, the intervention made in July took physical form. Not as a confrontation, not as a public correction, but as a quiet alteration of categories, an act of power that operates best when it looks like clerical hygiene. Inside the estate's controlled archive, letters, memoranda, and receipts that had once circulated freely as part of J.P. Morgan's working life were reclassified. The language mattered. Materials that could suggest disagreement, pressure, or negotiation were no longer treated as estate-relevant records. They were declared restricted or personal, a designation that sounds modest but carries decisive force. What is personal does not belong to probate. What does not belong to probate does not need to be weighed, indexed, or explained in the public accounting. With that shift, evidence did not have to be destroyed to lose its power. It only had to be moved. The action was administrative and precise. Counsel for the estate authorized the reassignment of annexes that had previously sat adjacent to core inventory documents, attachments that gave texture to decisions, correspondence that hinted at disagreements, receipts that placed people in rooms at particular moments. Once reclassified, those materials were removed from the chain of relevance. They could be stored elsewhere, accessed only with permission, or treated as outside the scope of any dispute. The public inventory, the one that could be read without standing, became clean to the point of sterility. It showed assets, distributions, and formal instruments, but none of the connective tissue that explains why those instruments exist. The absence was not accidental. It was produced. The place where this mattered most was not the surrogate's court, but the archive itself, a room, or rather a wing, whose access protocols changed without ceremony. What had once functioned as a family archive, open through familiarity and trust, was now an estate archive governed by clearance. Entry was limited, requests were logged, retrieval required approval. The room did not need a guard to feel closed. The rules did that work. For Anne Tracy Morgan, the consequence was immediate and concrete, even if she suspected that correspondence existed, which contextualized the settlement trace from May 9th. She could no longer reach it. The materials that might have allowed her to demonstrate pressure, coercion, or misrepresentation were now officially irrelevant to the process that defined her standing. This is the core of the alteration. The world itself was rearranged so that the record would no longer argue with the outcome. Once annexes are reclassified as personal, they cease to be admissible as part of the estate's story. They may still exist physically, but institutionally, they are mute. The legal mechanism does not accuse anyone. It simply redraws the boundary of relevance. And relevance in probate is everything. What is relevant must be disclosed, summarized, defended. What is not relevant can be ignored without consequence. By September 3rd, the estate had chosen which category would apply to anything that complicated the narrative of orderly succession. There was also a symbolic alteration that did not require a single document to be removed. Through legal drafting, careful, bloodless language, the position of certain individuals within the family narrative was adjusted, not erased. Adjusted. References to involvement became references to presence. Presence became courtesy. Courtesy became silence. A person's proximity to decision-making could be reduced without ever stating that it had been reduced. The mechanism is subtle but effective. If a name appears only in ceremonial contexts and not in records of action, history learns how to treat that person. Anne's role shifted from potential participant to peripheral figure, not by accusation, but by omission. The narrative no longer needed to explain her exclusion because the documents no longer implied that inclusion had ever been expected. The consequence of this alteration is measurable in the negative space it creates. Once annexes are declared non-belonging, any future challenge encounters a procedural wall. If Anne were to argue that a conflict existed, she would be asked for proof. If she pointed to correspondence, she would be told it was personal and therefore irrelevant. If she pointed to memoranda, she would be told they were restricted. If she pointed to receipts or notes that placed executors and counsel in particular conversations, she would be told those items had no bearing on distribution. The process would remain internally consistent while being externally opaque. The injustice does not require falsehood, it requires classification. This is why September 3rd matters more than any single instruction. Instructions can be rescinded. Classifications endure. Once a document is reclassified, it carries a different legal gravity. It becomes something that can be withheld without appearing to be withheld. The estate's public face benefits immediately. The inventory reads smoothly. There are no hints of dispute. There are no annexes that invite interpretation. The building stands, the philanthropy continues, the name remains unmarred. And the cost of that cleanliness is borne entirely by the person who might have used the discarded material to speak. The institution that performs this action does not see itself as editing history. It sees itself as organizing it. That distinction is essential. Organization sounds responsible. Editing sounds suspicious. But when organization determines what may count as evidence, it becomes indistinguishable from authorship. The estate did not need to deny that Anne existed or that she had concerns. It only needed to ensure that nothing she might use to substantiate those concerns belonged to the process that defined truth. In probate, belonging is a legal fact. And legal facts have consequences. The named entity that carries this power is not abstract. It is the estate itself, acting through council and trustees, operating under the authority granted by law and custom. No statute forbade the reclassification of annexes as personal. No rule required that correspondence be treated as estate relevant. The action was legal. That is precisely the problem. The injustice lives in the space where legality and fairness diverge, where something can be done correctly and still be wrong. On September 3rd, the estate altered the evidentiary environment so thoroughly that any later inquiry would begin already compromised. There is also a temporal consequence that is easy to miss. Once annexes are removed from relevance, time begins to work against the person excluded. Memories fade, staff change, informal knowledge dissipates. What remains is the official record, now purified. Even if someone later notices that the record feels too clean, too smooth, too complete, they will struggle to prove why. The documents that might have complicated the story are no longer part of the story. They exist, if they exist at all, as personal remnants without procedural force. History, encountering only what has been allowed to belong, learns the version it is given. This is why the injustice persists without noise. Anne does not need to be silenced publicly. The record has been taught not to hear her. And because the alteration is framed as categorization, rather than suppression, it resists moral language. It can be defended as prudence, as respect for privacy, as adherence to scope. Yet the effect is unmistakable. What could have proven conflict is now officially outside the process. The estate remains untouched because the tools that could have marked it are no longer recognized as tools. When a document is reclassified, is history corrected or edited? By the end of September 3rd, 1913, the answer is no longer theoretical. The archive has changed shape. The public inventory is clean. The annexes are restricted. The family narrative has been adjusted without accusation. And the person at the center of the opening injustice stands in the same position she occupied in July, but with fewer paths forward. The door is not locked. It is labeled, and labels, once applied, are harder to remove than locks. The image that closes this moment is not dramatic. A file cart rolled into a side room, a stamp pressed onto a folder reading "Personal," and a shelf where something used to sit now, holding nothing, preparing the way for the next step when absence itself will begin to do the work that documents once did. On January 14, 1914, the distribution of benefit became visible not through a celebratory announcement, but through the quiet consolidation of authority. By then, the earlier interventions had done their work. Access had been restricted, annexes reclassified, and the record streamlined. What remained was a structure ready to function with minimal friction. The primary beneficiary of that structure was J.P. Morgan Jr., whose position shifted from heir to unquestioned center of decision-making, not because a conflict had been resolved, but because it had been rendered administratively irrelevant. The action that mattered on that date was not a transfer of sentiment, it was a reassignment of control. Signatory authority was consolidated, approvals narrowed, and discretionary power concentrated in a smaller circle aligned with Morgan Jr. and the trustees, who shared his interest in continuity. This was not framed as exclusion, it was framed as efficiency. Fewer hands meant faster decisions, fewer voices meant clarity. In practice, it meant that any challenge, especially one rooted in earlier restrictions placed on Anne Tracy Morgan, no longer had a procedural pathway. Power does not need to announce who it benefits when it reorganizes itself around stability. Morgan Jr. benefited in ways that did not require him to speak. His authority expanded as a natural consequence of silence elsewhere. With the estate's governance tightened, he became the default interpreter of intent, the inheritor not only of assets, but of narrative. Trustees and council, now operating within a narrower approval structure, gained as well. Their relevance increased as intermediaries, their discretion reinforced by the same procedures that had removed contested materials from relevance. The institution itself, the Morgan household, name, its financial standing, its public image, was strengthened by the absence of visible dispute. Stability became proof of legitimacy, and legitimacy justified the means by which it was achieved. The concrete change lay in control over decisions that shaped the future of the estate. Investments, philanthropic commitments, and public-facing representations now flowed through fewer channels. The action of power was administrative but decisive. Authority was declared and exercised by those already positioned to benefit from an uncontested record. The consequence was institutional. The estate could present itself as orderly and unified at a moment when financial confidence depended on appearances as much as on numbers. The cost of that order was borne by the conflict that had been neutralized rather than addressed. What makes this moment morally charged is not that Morgan Jr. gained wealth, inheritance presumes gain, but that the system rewarded silence with legitimacy. The human conflict that had prompted restrictions and reclassifications became the justification for excluding it altogether. Trustees and administrators could point to the smooth functioning of governance as evidence that intervention had been correct. The absence of dispute was treated as success. The logic completed itself. Because there was no visible conflict, those who now held power must have been right to contain it. This is how benefit operates in institutional terms. It does not require a villain's monologue. It requires alignment. Morgan Jr.'s interests aligned with trustees who valued continuity, with council who valued discretion, and with an environment that equated public calm with moral correctness. The estate's stability became an argument against revisiting the past. Any attempt to reopen questions could be framed as reckless, even dangerous. The beneficiary of that framing was the structure itself, and by extension, the person at its center. The consequence extended beyond money. Social standing, influence, and the ability to shape future narratives accrued to those whose authority was now uncontested. Anne's earlier exclusion mattered here precisely because it had already reduced her to an absence in the record. When benefits were consolidated, there was no competing claim to weigh, no documented dissent to reconcile. The system did not deny her, it simply proceeded without her. January 14th, 1914 marks the point at which the injustice completed its transformation. What began as a restriction of access ended as a redistribution of legitimacy. The empire's stability was cited implicitly as reason enough to nullify the human cost. And once stability is accepted as the highest good, every prior act becomes defensible. The image that closes this moment is restrained and exact. A ledger open on a polished desk, a short list of authorized signatures beneath a single name, and a margin left blank where another acknowledgement might have appeared. An empty space that confirms who benefited and who was no longer meant to be seen as the investigation moves toward what vanished entirely. On March 27, 1914, the record crossed a line it could not later admit had ever existed. What disappeared did not vanish with noise or scandal. It vanished by procedure. Correspondence that had once moved through the estate's internal channels, letters that required answers, memoranda that implied disagreement, notes that carried dates and names, ceased to circulate. In their place remained references without attachments, file numbers that pointed nowhere, index entries that acknowledged something had existed without preserving what it was. The action was concrete. Documents were removed from the active flow and either destroyed under the language of routine disposal or retained privately outside the estate archive, beyond the reach of probate review. The consequence was final. Without documents, the dispute could no longer be argued. It could only be remembered, and memory carries no legal weight. The physical environment changed to match the paper trail. Rooms associated with the person in conflict were closed under neutral justifications: maintenance, preservation, reorganization. A door once used as a passage became a barrier without accusation. Nothing dramatic was said. The room was simply no longer available. In institutional language, space itself can be reassigned. And when space is reassigned, it signals that a presence is no longer required. For Anne Tracy Morgan, this mattered more than symbolism. Spaces hold objects. Objects hold traces. When a room is closed, its contents lose immediacy. They become stored, boxed, or dispersed. What is not immediately accessible becomes easy to forget, and what is forgotten becomes easy to deny. The act of disappearance was not singular. It was cumulative. A letter missing here, a memorandum unlocated there, a receipt no longer attached to a decision. Each absence could be explained individually. Together, they formed a pattern. The estate did not need to issue an order saying, "Destroy the record." It only needed to allow ordinary processes to operate without correction. Routine disposal policies exist for a reason. So do private retentions. When applied selectively, they erase without appearing to erase. The estate exercised power by omission, by allowing certain materials to fall outside protection while ensuring that the clean inventory remained intact. The institutional entity responsible was not a person, but the estate apparatus itself, acting through staff, council, and trustees whose authority had already been consolidated. No single signature marks the moment. That is the point. Disappearance, when done correctly, leaves no author. It leaves only the result. The consequence was legal and enduring. Any later attempt to revisit the conflict would confront a wall of absence. Without letters, claims become speculation. Without memoranda, pressure becomes allegation. Without attachments, references become meaningless. The system does not need to prove innocence when proof has been made impossible. This is where silence completes its transformation into evidence. Once the documents are gone, the absence itself is treated as confirmation that nothing improper occurred. If there had been a problem, the reasoning goes, there would be records. Because there are no records, there must have been no problem. The logic is circular and effective. It rewards the act of erasure by turning it into validation. The injustice is no longer active. It is archived as normality. What vanished on March 27th was not only paper, it was the ability to contest. Anne's position shifted from excluded participant to historical footnote, not because she lacked a claim, but because the materials that could have supported it were no longer allowed to exist in any forum that mattered. The estate moved forward unchallenged. The beneficiary of that forward motion was the structure itself, which could now present its continuity as unbroken and its governance as justified by results. The danger of this moment is easy to underestimate because it feels administrative. But disappearance is the most decisive act an institution can perform. Alteration can be reversed, decisions can be reconsidered, even benefit can be redistributed. Disappearance ends the conversation. It ensures that future scrutiny encounters a smooth surface. Historians, journalists, and heirs are left with references that promise more than they deliver. The record becomes a map with missing roads. The injustice remains alive precisely because it cannot be proven. That is its final form. The person harmed is left with certainty and no evidence. The institution is left with evidence and no certainty. And the world, encountering only what survives, learns to treat the silence as resolution. The image that closes this stage is spare and exact. An index card bearing a citation, the space beneath it marked "Attachment Missing," and beyond the archive, a closed door with a small placard reading "Preservation," a word that protects the building while confirming that what mattered most has already been removed, preparing the investigation for the moment when absence itself becomes policy. On August 6, 1914, something appeared that should not have been able to exist in the form it took. Not a revelation, not a confession, an inconsistency, the kind that survives only because it was never meant to be read closely. In the estate's administrative file, a page surfaced bearing a signature dated to a day when the signatory was already recorded elsewhere under a different obligation. The calendar does not bend easily, and neither do ledgers. Yet the document asked both to comply. The action that made this possible was procedural. A late entry was accepted into the archive as a corrective measure, logged quietly as if it were completing a record rather than revising it. The consequence was immediate and dangerous to the official story, because corrections that arrive after the fact invite a different question than errors that occur in real time. The inconsistency was technical, not emotional. A rubric placed too low on the page, a pagination sequence that did not match the surrounding folios, a notation reading "copy filed" with no original attached. Each of these elements can be explained in isolation. Together, they describe a pattern that resists coincidence. The estate apparatus had already demonstrated its ability to restrict, reclassify, and allow documents to disappear. What August 6th introduced was a subtler problem, evidence of editorial movement after closure. The record was no longer merely incomplete. It had been adjusted. The administrative action that allowed this was acceptance. Someone declared the late page admissible. Someone reassigned its place in the sequence. Someone permitted a copy to stand where an original would normally be. Required. These are not passive acts. They require authority. They require discretion. And discretion, once consolidated earlier in the process, had already been aligned with the interests of continuity. The consequence is legal and institutional. Once a correction is normalized, the boundary between clarification and revision dissolves. The record becomes a living surface, capable of absorbing changes without acknowledging their origin. For the person already excluded, Anne Tracy Morgan, the editor, danger is acute, an inconsistency that suggests editing would normally open space for challenge, but challenge requires access, and access had been removed months earlier. The late arriving page did not restore balance, it reinforced asymmetry. Those who controlled the archive could adjust it. Those outside it could only notice that something did not align without the means to prove why. The injustice deepened not because a mistake was made, but because a mistake was tolerated in a system that had eliminated the possibility of independent verification. The date itself sharpens the tension. August 1914 marked the outbreak of war in Europe, a moment when financial institutions were preoccupied with stability, liquidity, and confidence. In such an environment, administrative smoothness was prized. Questions were liabilities. The estate's incentive was not to invite scrutiny, but to maintain coherence. A page that arrived late, bearing a signature that closed a gap, could be framed as housekeeping. The alternative, acknowledging a discrepancy, would have required reopening files that had already been sealed by classification and disappearance. The choice was not debated, it was exercised. What makes this inconsistency powerful is not that it proves intent on its own. It does not. What it proves is possibility. If a page can be inserted after the record is presumed settled, then the record is not a neutral container. It is an instrument, and instruments are used. The late entry suggests that someone noticed the absence created in March and chose not to leave it visible. The solution was not to recover what had disappeared, but to add something new, something that could pass as completion rather than correction. The consequence ripples forward. Any future reader encountering the file would see a closed sequence. The discomfort of the missing attachment would be softened by the presence of a new page. The signature would reassure. The date would be glanced at, not interrogated. Silence would resume its role as evidence of order, and the injustice at the center, the restriction, the reclassification, the disappearance, would remain intact, now shielded by the appearance of thoroughness. This is where the investigation tightens. Errors are common, edits are not. An error happens once and remains. An edit arrives when someone decides the record needs help. The administrative language surrounding the August 6 entry treats it as the former. The circumstances suggest the latter, and because the estate had already normalized the removal of contested materials, the late page did not stand out as a violation. It blended into a process that had learned how to absorb anomalies without triggering alarms. What matters more in a case like this, the missing page or the page that arrives too late? The block closes on a restrained image. A bound file reopened after being marked complete. A single page slipped between others, its ink darker, its margins narrower, its numbering slightly off. An addition that resolves nothing but prepares the way for the next stage, when such adjustments cease to feel exceptional and begin to look routine. By October 1914, the risk calculation was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, rehearsed, and quietly decisive. If the sequence of restrictions, reclassifications, disappearances, and late-filed corrections had come to light as a single narrative, the impact would not have been confined to a family. Embarrassment. It would have reoriented how the Morgan legacy itself was read. The injustice at the center, and Tracy Morgan silenced, documents removed, access controlled, would have given the press a frame it understood instantly. A powerful household suppressing an inconvenient witness to preserve continuity. That frame does not need proof beyond plausibility. It needs alignment. And in October 1914, alignment was already in place. The action of power in this month was preventative, not reactive. The estate apparatus maintained restrictions, upheld ceilings, and declined disclosure requests that might have invited synthesis. Nothing new had to be done publicly because everything necessary had already been done privately. The consequence was institutional protection. By keeping the elements separated, no single file showing the full arc, the estate ensured that no editor could assemble a clean headline without risking legal pushback or reputational retaliation. Silence was preserved not because the story was weak, but because the cost of telling it was high. Had the story broken, it would have landed in a press environment primed for it. The country was already debating private power and public accountability. A headline about a silenced relative would have reframed the Morgan name from stabilizer to subject. It would have invited retrospection. Readers would not only ask what happened to Anne, but what the episode suggested about how decisions had been made for decades. That kind of scrutiny does not stay confined to one dispute. It radiates outward, touching philanthropic boards, cultural institutions, and financial relationships that rely on trust more than contracts. The market consequences would not have required collapse to be real. Confidence operates on margin. Even modest doubt can introduce noise, and noise is expensive. Institutions associated with the household name could have faced questions from partners and rivals alike, each with an incentive to exploit uncertainty. Competitors do not need proof to apply pressure. They need rumor, timing, and a narrative that forces explanation. Explanation in turn requires documents. Documents, as the estate understood, were precisely what had been made inaccessible. There were political implications as well. October 1914 sat in the shadow of ongoing debates about influence without accountability. A public dispute exposing internal suppression would have provided a concrete example. One that legislators and commentators could cite without mastering financial abstractions. A human story gives shape to structural critique. The risk was not indictment. It was normalization of suspicion. Once the public accepts that private power manages dissent internally, every subsequent assertion of legitimacy carries an asterisk. This is why the cost-benefit analysis resolved the way it did. The cost of truth was open-ended. It threatened reputation, alliances, and the long-term interpretive frame surrounding the estate. The cost of silence, by contrast, was contained. It could be paid privately, through settlements, through exclusion, through the quiet suffering of one person whose claims could be rendered unprovable. From an institutional perspective, the choice was efficient. From a moral perspective, it was devastating. But morality was not the category being optimized. The administrative actions that sustained this outcome were simple. Disclosures were restricted, annexes remained sealed, late corrections were accepted without inquiry, and absence was treated as closure. Each action was defensible on its own. Together, they formed a barrier against synthesis. The injustice stayed fragmented, and fragmentation is the enemy of scandal. Without a complete picture, there is nothing to publish, nothing to litigate, nothing to debate at scale. The consequence is that the silence itself became an asset. It preserved the appearance of stability at a moment when instability, global, political, financial, was already abundant. The estate did not need to gamble on public vindication. It only needed to avoid public confrontation. and avoiding confrontation required that the record remain unreadable as a whole. This is the risk that governed every prior choice. Not that someone might notice an inconsistency, but that someone might connect it. Not that a page was missing, but that missing pages could be assembled into a pattern. By October 1914, the estate's strategy had ensured that pattern recognition was impossible without access, and access was the one thing that had been systematically removed. The image that closes this calculation is not dramatic. It is a newspaper layout mocked up and then abandoned, a headline penciled and erased because the documents required to stand it up cannot be obtained. The story dies not for lack of relevance, but for lack of admissible material, leaving the injustice intact and the investigation poised for the moment when suppression itself becomes routine rather than strategic. By 1915, silence no longer required intention. It no longer needed meetings, justifications, or protective instructions. It had become routine. What began as a targeted response to an inconvenient conflict was absorbed into procedure, vocabulary, and habit. The injustice did not persist because people actively conspired each day to maintain it. It persisted because the system had learned how to carry it forward without thinking. The language tells the story. Files were no longer denied, they were marked restricted. Rooms were not closed. They were placed under preservation or maintenance. Requests were not refused. They were reclassified as private family matters. These terms did not accuse, they did not explain, they normalized. Once written into internal guidance and repeated often enough, they ceased to sound exceptional. They became the neutral grammar of administration. And grammar, once learned, governs behavior more effectively than orders. Procedurally, the archive changed shape. Triaging became standard. Materials were screened before being logged. Originals were quietly replaced with copies, and copies circulated without context. Partial sealing became the default for anything that might invite interpretation. The action of power here was structural. Access was restricted not in response to a question, but in anticipation of one. Staff learned which categories triggered caution and which did not. Over time, no one needed to be told what to remove or omit. The form itself taught them. The estate apparatus, now fully institutionalized, benefited from this transformation. Council and trustees operated within a system that protected them from scrutiny by design. Decisions made years earlier no longer appeared as decisions at all. They appeared as policy. The consequence was institutional. The injustice lost its edges. It could no longer be identified as an act because it had been converted into process. What was once extraordinary became indistinguishable from routine record-keeping. For Anne Tracy Morgan, this was the most final exclusion of all. There was no longer a door to knock on, no moment to appeal. The system had moved past her without acknowledging that it had ever paused. Silence was no longer enforced against her specifically, it was enforced universally. Any attempt to revisit the past encountered a standardized response, delivered without malice and, without exception. The injustice survived because it no longer looked like injustice, it looked like order. This is how institutions protect themselves over time. They remove the memory of choice. The early acts, the restriction of access, the reclassification of documents, the disappearance of correspondence could have been questioned while they were still visible as interventions. Normalization erased that visibility. By 1915, no one needed to justify why certain materials were unavailable. They simply were. And what simply is rarely invites moral inquiry. The consequence reaches beyond this case. Once silence is proceduralized, it can be reused. The same terms, the same forms, the same circulation rules apply to the next conflict and the one after that. Injustice becomes scalable. It can be applied without personal animus, without explicit instruction, without leaving fingerprints. The system learns how to transform harm into compliance. This is the moment when the record becomes most deceptive. Not because it lies, but because it appears complete. The archive functions smoothly, the inventory balances, the legacy remains intact. And yet, the absence at the center, the missing correspondence, the erased presence, the unanswerable questions, has been fully absorbed. The system no longer recognizes it as absence, it recognizes it as normal. The image that closes this stage is administrative and cold, a standardized form stamped restricted, filed without comment, indistinguishable from hundreds of others. Proof that what began as a specific injustice has now been converted into routine, setting the stage for the final reckoning, where the past survives only in what was never allowed to be reviewed. By April 1924, the legacy stood finished, orderly, and publicly uncontested. The structures associated with the Morgan name remained exactly as they were meant to be seen: permanent, refined, immune to the disorder of individual conflict. The narrative that accompanied them had settled into a familiar cadence: philanthropy emphasized, architecture admired, influence framed as stewardship rather than control. What endured was the image of continuity. What did not endure was any visible trace of the administrative path that made that continuity possible. The action of power at this stage was not dramatic, it was preservative. The estate apparatus declared the record complete and moved forward as if completion were a natural state rather than a curated. And by treating the archive as settled, it implicitly reassigned any unresolved questions to irrelevance. The consequence was institutional closure. Once a record is considered finished, the burden shifts entirely to anyone who claims otherwise. And without annexes, correspondence, or decision-level attribution, that burden cannot be met. The public story was clean by design. Philanthropic giving could be documented. Architectural commissions could be photographed and celebrated. The names of firms like McKim, Mead and White could be attached to facades that communicated prestige without context. Buildings do not testify, they stand, and standing is persuasive. A monument does not explain how authority moved through rooms, how access was restricted, or how silence was normalized. It only proves that resources flowed without interruption. In this way, architecture became the most effective witness for the defense. It suggested permanence, taste, and legitimacy, qualities that discourage inquiry rather than invite it. What the official narrative did not explain by 1924 was precisely what mattered most to the injustice at the center of this case. Why do certain annexes never appear alongside core documents? Why do references exist without attachments? Why do names vanish from records of decision while remaining present in ceremonial contexts? These are not gaps created by time. They are gaps created by process. The contradiction is structural. The monument requires a path of administration to exist, yet that path is incomplete by design. The estate presents outcomes without accounting for methods. The beneficiary of this arrangement was not only the Morgan name, but the broader logic of private governance. By preserving a great man story, unmarred by internal dissent, the estate reinforced a model in which influence could be exercised without accountability and then fossilized into legacy. The cost of that model, the exclusion of Anne Tracy Morgan, the disappearance of her documentary presence, the erasure of conflict, was absorbed and forgotten, not contested, forgotten. The difference matters. Contest leaves scars. Forgetting leaves none. The injustice persists here not as an unresolved argument, but as an unresolved absence, and does not reappear in the record to challenge the narrative. The archive does not reopen to explain its own omissions. The system moves on, carrying forward a version of events that is coherent only because alternative versions were never allowed to belong. In 1924, that coherence looks like truth to anyone who encounters it for the first time. There is no visible reason to doubt it, and doubt, without evidence, is easily dismissed as speculation. This is the most durable form of institutional power, the ability to end a story without answering it. The estate did not need to rebut accusations because none could be substantiated. It did not need to defend decisions because the documents that would have revealed decision-making were no longer relevant, no longer present, no longer retrievable. The record functioned as a closed circuit. Everything that remained supported everything else. The contradiction embedded in this legacy is subtle but decisive. A monument implies process. It implies planning, approval, negotiation, funding, and execution. Yet when one traces those processes administratively, the trail thins at precisely the moments where human conflict would have surfaced. The aesthetic survives, intact. The administrative logic does not. That mismatch is not accidental. It is the residue of choices made between 1913 and 1915, choices that were never reversed and therefore never acknowledged. By April 1924, the injustice no longer needed protection. It was already protected by time, by normalization, and by the authority of an archive that appeared complete. The legacy that remained did not lie. It simply omitted. And omission, when sustained long enough, becomes indistinguishable from truth. The closing image is architectural and quiet. A stone facade, credited to McKim, Mead, and White, its lines precise, its presence unquestioned. Beneath it, somewhere beyond public access, an administrative path that does not quite connect. Folders that do not resolve into explanations, references that do not lead to documents. The building stands, the story holds, and the space between them, intentionally unfinished, prepares the ground for the final question. What it means when a legacy survives precisely because the record that would explain it was never allowed to be whole. By January 1931, enough time had passed for administration to harden into history. What began as a sequence of choices, made quietly, justified narrowly, executed precisely, had settled into something that no longer appeared chosen at all. It appeared inevitable. Doors once closed for maintenance were now simply closed. Files once marked restricted were now simply absent. The record stood finished because it had been declared finished, and that declaration carried the authority of habit. This is the institutional moral that endures when decades do their work. Durable power does not rely on wealth alone. It relies on custody, of records, of access, of language. Money builds structures. Administration decides what those structures will be allowed to mean. A court is not always the arena where outcomes are won. Often, the decisive contest takes place elsewhere, in an archive, in a filing room, in the careful selection of words that transform conflict into procedure and memory into policy. The elite does not need to prevail before a judge if it prevails before the index. By the early 1930s, the system no longer needed to defend itself. The narrative had been standardized, philanthropy read as virtue, architecture read as permanence. The great man story read as destiny rather than design. What it did not read as was a chain of administrative acts, restrictions imposed, annexes reclassified, pages arriving late, rooms closed, originals replaced by copies that converted a human dispute into an administrative footnote and then into nothing at all. The truth was not defeated. It was reclassified, and reclassification is how institutions buy time, until time itself does the rest. Walk the corridors now and listen to what remains. You will hear doors closing softly, not in anger, but in routine. You will see documents placed back into folders, string-tied, stamps pressed with the calm authority of repetition. Dust settles, light thins, echoes travel farther than voices. In these halls, permanence is achieved not by answering questions, but by ensuring the questions no longer have standing. What survives is not the argument, but the facade. Not the path, but the monument. This is why mansions and legacies must be read as products of invisible decisions rather than gifts of fate. Stone and marble testify to resources, not to processes. They cannot explain who was excluded from the room, which papers were deemed irrelevant, or how silence learned to speak the language of order. To read them critically is not to deny their beauty. It is to ask what had to be set aside for that beauty to endure untroubled. If you remain with us, do so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if this account resonated, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again, because there are other wings, other staircases, other archives where similar grammars of power still whisper. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.